Good evening, everyone. If you can't find a seat, there also is a balcony in the back. It's wonderful to have such a full chapel this evening. I'm Serene Jones, and I am the president of Union Theological Seminary, and I am so thrilled to welcome you here for this wonderful occasion. The affiliation of the Episcopal Divinity School with Union Theological Seminary is an exciting new thing. It's an exciting time for us here in this room. It's an exciting time this evening, and I couldn't be happier about my good friend, the very Reverend Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, the leader of EDS at UTS. Tonight's Dean address is one part of the bigger inaugural convocation for EDS at Union. And we hope after this evening's talk you will join us downstairs. If you go down the stairs of the chapel, you'll get to a very dark hallway, and you'll think you're going into the bowels of the building, and you will end up in a place called the social hall. So grab a Union person if you get lost, but we'll have a reception there. The theme for the whole convocation is Towards a Just Earth, Courageous Faith in Challenging Times. And no one can doubt tonight that we are living in challenging times in our country. It's a time when we must all come together in love and show what our church proclaims, that goodness and mercy prevail. And that's why it's so important for seminaries like EDS at UTS to develop theologically grounded, impassioned lovers, preachers of justice who can work inside and outside of the churches to make that change. And now I have the pleasure of introducing someone to you who knows about seeking justice inside and outside of the church and what that means when it's truly courageous and breaks barriers. The Right Reverend Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows was ordained and consecrated Bishop of Indianapolis in 2017, making her the first Black woman to lead a diocese in the history of the Episcopal Church. She is also the first woman to succeed another woman as the diocesan bishop. A defining experience of Bishop Baskerville-Burrows' ministry for us in New York came when she found herself near the World Trade Center the morning of September 11th, 2001. In the midst of that fearful situation, it was her own faith and those of others who sought shelter alongside her that gave her a renewed, empowered perspective on the capacity of faith to vanquish fear. And today she brings that perspective and courageous faith into everything she does as a bishop. Please welcome Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows.
I have to say thank you for all of that. It is a delight to be in this space, particularly because this was the first seminary campus I ever stepped foot on. My first job out of college was renting space at a new nonprofit at the God Box across the street, and I was preparing for baptism and studying, and I would come over here with my eyes wide open, trying to understand what a seminary was about. And over time, in the 2 years I worked in that building, began to wrestle with ministry, and it was in this space that I began to dream those dreams. And so it's particularly wonderful to come back on this occasion. It's also a delight because of what is happening here, this inaugural convocation of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, and how we come to celebrate The installation, this ministry, the culmination of so much work over the years of the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas as the first dean of EDS at Union Theological Seminary. I don't need to tell you that she is the scholar and the academician and the prophetic and pastoral voice that our time and these days desperately need. Our church and our world are overdue for a market correction, if you will. It has been a long time. It's been a long time coming to bring into alignment and to center the fearless prophetic word with rigorous academic scholarship and relevant pastoral preparation for clergy and lay leaders for the church and the world that is now, not the one from 50 years ago, not the one even 10 years ago, but for now. As Presiding Bishop Michael Curry preaches and leads us to explicitly center our discipleship and formation in the ways of Jesus that are loving and liberating and life-giving, Dr. Brown Douglas and her leadership in the theological realm helps us to actually contain all of that in ways that bring scholarship and practical ministry together. Her leadership in this area could not have come at a better time because theology students, priests, and pastors, those called to the diaconal ministry of bringing the gospel to the public arena and back, and activists on the protest line, they all need the biblical, womanist, prophetic, and theological gifts that Dr. Brown Douglas has to bring to our church and to our world. And not only her gifts, but the way she is bringing others to teach alongside her. Many of us who are deeply engaged in the institutional church have said that we want a different kind of church. Well, this is how you get it. By forming lay and clergy leaders to understand that justice is Orthodox theology, and that we get a different kind of church when our lay and clergy leaders understand that leading and living in the loving, liberating, and life-giving ways of Jesus is not an academic exercise. It's not just a snappy tagline for the Jesus movement, but it's foundational for dismantling the white supremacy that undermines the justice of God. So by engaging theological education in this way, EDS at Union graduates can support and empower and encourage our congregations, not in saving the institutional church, but in helping to transform the world. There's a difference. This occasion is significant for many other reasons, not the least of which is that Dr. Brown Douglas is continuing to shatter the glass ceilings of both the church and the academy. I've been observing and learning and listening and being inspired by the black girl magic that is Dr. Brown Douglas for over 30 years. Therefore, it is of little surprise to me that we now celebrate her as the first African-American, male or female, to be dean of an Episcopal seminary in the United States. As the first black woman to be ordained priest out of the Diocese of Southern Ohio, she knows the significance of being the first. I'll tell you that over the past 2 years as bishop, I've grown to appreciate both the privilege and the weight of embodying a dream. The dream and possibility for making the rougher places plain for others to follow. And by others, I mean particularly women of color who desire to dream and discern and gain access to positions not previously afforded us. In the Diocese of Indianapolis, a diocese that is by any rough measure about 90% white, I don't quite have the words to express what it means to have a photo of a black woman hanging in the churches. It's a thing. It is a literal sign and symbol that our church can be what we say we want to be, one that can raise up and center those who have been historically been at the margins. Every time I see a photo of Dr. Brown Douglas on the EDS at Union website, or on a brochure, or presenting in person, I'm reminded that our church really means it. We're trying so hard. And I've got people who want to go to seminary who say, I want to go to a seminary that has a dean that looks like that preaches the way she preaches, who teaches the way she teaches, and helps to build up another generation to follow. In the world of Episcopal bishops, we waited 14 years between the consecration of Barbara Harris as the first woman and the first black woman in the Anglican Communion and suffragan bishop of Massachusetts, 14 years between Barbara Harris and Gail Harris, the second black woman in the House of Bishops. Between Gail Harris and my consecration as first black woman diocesan, 14 years. Between my consecration and the consecration of Bishop Carly Hughes as the first black and first woman diocesan bishop of Newark, we waited 16 months. 16 months. So my prayer, Dr. Brown Douglas, is that while you will always be the first, that you will not always be the only. Your call to serve as Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union is a signal of hope. It is a sign of hope and possibility for so many of us in the Episcopal Church and beyond. So I pray that your tenure would be long and fruitful, and that God would raise up other women and men of color particularly, to come after you as faculty and deans of seminaries. Until then, I'm grateful that you are surrounded by an amazing community of theologians and scholars of many races and backgrounds, remembering especially those who have gone on to their glory, who look down on this night, Dr. James Cone, Dr. Katie Cannon, those who have longed for this day and beam with pride. So I bid you all to watch carefully, glasses shattering everywhere. And may the glass ceilings that break today be a part of bearing forth God's mission for the church in these days. Thank you.
So I would be remiss not to mention 4 people who are here with us tonight who were very involved in the affiliation and the bringing of Kelly to EDS at UTS as dean. And that is Bonnie Anderson, who is the chair of the EDS board, Gary Hall and Chris Holding, and then Bill Candelaria, who's the vice chair of Union's board. Could the 4 of you just stand so we can applaud you? So I was part of those conversations about the creation of EDS at UTS, and we knew from the beginning that the first dean would set the pace, indeed symbolically embody what the school would be in its becoming and in its future. And we knew from the start that there was one person in this universe that had the qualities that this endeavor required. We knew we needed an academic who had a scholarly reputation exceeded by none, who was widely published and respected around the world for her work, who, in terms of academic standing, commanded respect in all corners of the world, and who had a future of scholarship ahead of her. But we also knew that we wouldn't be content with simply a scholar who pondered great things simply for the pleasure of pondering them. No, Kelly could never do that. We needed a scholar activist because of the deep history of both Union and EDS, is embedded in that sense of activism and engagement in the world. That is who both institutions in their history have always been. But we also knew, lastly, and perhaps most importantly, that we needed a leader who carried the church inside herself, who was church, in whom the being of the church was not just a set of doctrines and proclamations and liturgies and actions, but actually the Spirit of Christ and the table that is set for us all. Someone who was a pastor, someone who had the quality of presence that made our collective church, as in global church, present in the world. So it's no accident that that one person in the universe was Kelly Brown Douglas, and that we are here this evening celebrating, now 2 months into the start of a wildly successful affiliation and Episcopal program here at Union Theological Seminary. It is my delight to now formally introduce her. As you all know, she is the author of several books, including Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, which calls out white supremacy and American exceptionalism for its role in the condemnation and exclusion of black people. Her courageous faith allows her to write such books, and we know will guide her as she leads EDS at Union. Please welcome with me Dean Kelly Brown Douglas.
Thank you. Boy, I am so humbled. I am so humbled to be here. I am humbled by the opportunity to hear and accept this call by the grace of God. I am humbled by the presence of each and every one of you. No one walks a journey alone. And you are all here as a part of that journey with me. I see family that God has given me through birth. I see family that God has blessed me with as I have walked on this journey. I'll introduce more of them tomorrow in particular. I am grateful and thankful for the opportunities that God has given me to serve. And I am most blessed to be able to serve at this time in my life at this place. I thank the boards of Union Theological Seminary and of the Episcopal Divinity School for hearing the call of God to carry on a mission and finding a way to do it. Thank you for your work, your vision, and hearing that call, and somehow messing up and calling me. I thank you. And let me say, I couldn't be here and do this work without knowing that I'm walking that path with. When I grow up, I want to be like my Bishop, Jennifer Baskerville. So inspiring. and we're in this together, and I knew I could not come to this evening without her presence here, because I'm inspired by her faith and the journey she's walked. And what can I say? Before I accepted this call, I was going to make Serene go to the doctor and get a checkup and make sure she was going to be around for a long time. There's no way possible to do this without the sister that is Serene. Thank you. She's my sister and my mentor and helps me every day. So I thank you all for being here. Thank you for this opportunity, and most of all, I thank you for your faithfulness. And so I want to reflect a little bit with you this evening on what it really means to be seminary in these challenging times. Let me begin my address with a story that I've told before, and so I ask for the indulgence of those of you who may have heard it more than once. This story takes place on a hot Wednesday afternoon in August. My brother, 2 sisters, and I were playing in our bedrooms while my parents were sitting on the living room couch watching something on TV. Out of nowhere, with a sense of urgency, my mother called the 4 of us to come quickly to see what they were watching. We all ran in, not quite knowing what to expect. When we got there, my parents told us to sit down and to watch because history was being made. I did not know what they meant by that, but I followed their instructions, as did my siblings. We all sat and watched the history that was being made on the television screen. I remember watching and wondering why so many people, especially black people, were all standing in the hot sun listening to a man give a speech. My then 6-year-old mind was not taking in what he was saying. What I was taking in, however, was my parents' reactions to his words. Both were clearly moved by this man's speech. Occasionally, one of them would utter, "That's right," or "You tell him." That history-making day, as perhaps some of you have figured out, was August 28th, 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. seized the American imagination with his dream for this nation and its people. What I did not realize then was that for my parents, the history being made on that screen was about their hope that the dream they had for their 4 children was coming closer to reality on that day at the Lincoln Memorial. They, too, wanted their 4 children to live in a world where they, as King said, will not be judged for the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. They too wanted, as King dreamed, a world where little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. Their dream for my brothers, sisters, and me was King's dream for our world. What I also did not realize at that time was the sense of urgency that my parents no doubt felt as they listened to King. For they knew what I would come to know many years later, and that was that 8 years prior, on that very day, another mother's dream for her child had come to a tragic end. In the 2:00 a.m. hour of August 28, 1955, Mamie Till's 14-year-old son, Emmett Lewis Till, was dragged from his relative's home at which he was staying in Mississippi, again lynched because he was accused of flirting with a 22-year-old white woman. Over 16 years later, this woman admitted that she had fabricated parts of the story that led to Emmett's monstrous murder at the hands of her then husband and his half-brother, both now deceased, but both of whom, after being found innocent of Till's murder by an all-white jury, bragged in Look magazine about how they indeed lynched Emmett that August 28th morning and disposed of his body in the Tallahatchie River. Now, why am I beginning my dean's address with the story of this August 28th day in our nation's history? Because this one day in August reflects the challenging context in which we find ourselves today. In his classic 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, who, by the way, died on August 27, 1963, just one day before King's speech. Du Bois, in that text, speaks of the warring souls of African Americans, at once African, yet once American. This poignant image of warring souls provides an apt description of our nation more than 50 years after Martin King's speech and Emmett Till's lynching. For ours is a nation with a warring soul. Borrowing from the words of Du Bois, we are a nation with two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. We have yet to decide if we are going to be a nation and a people defined by Martin Luther King's dream, or a nation and a people defined by Emmett Lewis Till's lynching. Indeed, the warring soul of this nation is most manifest today by the very fact that this nation can boldly declare that all are created equal and endowed with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, yet elect to make America great again with a vision defined by a racially chauvinistic agenda and inhumane xenophobic policies, and one that also traffics in toxic, misogynistic, and LGBTQ-phobic realities. There is no getting around it. Ours is a nation with a warring soul. That we as a nation find ourselves in this warring soul predicament is not new. For such a soul is intrinsic to our country's very identity. And so throughout our nation's history, we have been challenged by the reality of two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas. Are we going to be a slave nation or a free nation? Are we going to be a Jim and Jane Crow nation or a just and equal nation? Are we going to be a xenophobic and intolerant nation or a multiracial, multicultural, and welcoming nation? Until we as a nation, as a people, make a decision, we will continually find ourselves in warring soul times of chaos and crises. But with that said, there is something new about this time. That new is us. This warring soul moment is ours. This is our time to have a say about what kind of nation, what kind of people we want to be. My friends, I am convinced that this time that is ours is nothing less than a Kairos time. That is a decisive moment in history that potentially has far-reaching impact. For as former professor of theology here at Union Theological Seminary, Paul Tillich described, the Kairos is a time where through chaos and crisis, God is fully present, providing an opening to a new way of being in the world, a new way of being with one another, and even a new way of being with God. And thus, as Tillich explained, it is a time that demands an existential decision. Let us be clear. This is our time of decision. Yes, as a nation. Yes, as a people. But most importantly, it is into this warring soul time that we at EDS at Union began this new chapter. And so, It is into this time that we must make a decision about who we are and what it means for us to be a theological seminary at such a warring soul time as this. In this new chapter in our lives, we must define the soul of who we are. And the answer to this question is not inconsequential. For as convinced as I am of this being a Kairos time, I am even more convinced that if our nation is going to resolve this war of its soul by living into the best of who it has declared itself to be, then it are theological and faith communities that must lead the way to the better impulses, to the better angels, if you will, of who we can be as a nation and a people. Why? Why must we lead the way? By virtue of the fact that we are a theological seminary, the core of our very identity, and that which animates our very existence, that being our soul, is not defined by the mercurial and compromising declarations of human beings, nor is it accountable to the frailties of human history. Rather, the soul of who we are is connected to God, a God who, as Anglican theologian Vita Scudder succinctly says, is love, a phrase, she says, that cannot be improved. Then there is this. As EDS at Union, we are not just a theological school or community. We are a seminary. And if we take seriously the root meaning of the word seminary, then we know we are to be a seed bed. That is, we are to plant the seeds to do the work of God in the world. Paraphrasing the words of Scudder, our work as a theological seminary is to evolve a society which bears some likeness to God's sublime nature of love. And as liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez says, to know the God who is love is to work for justice. And so, what does all of this mean for who we are to be as we began this new chapter as EDS at Union? It means in preparing our students for their various ministries in the world, we are to plant the seeds of justice. That is, we are to plant the seeds for the evolving of a just earth. This is the work our soul must have, as former EDS professor and Union alum Katie G. Cannon would say. So what does that soul work look like? This work begins, I believe, with being a seminary that fosters moral dialogue. Moral dialogue is informed by two givens. First, that each and every person without exception is a cherished and indispensable part of God's human family. And therefore, each and every person without exception is sacred and has sacred worth. Second, none of us, by virtue of our marginalized or privileged status or any other attribute, have an indispensable corner on the truth. Hence, to be a seminary that nurtures moral dialogue is to be a place energized by conversations in and out of the classroom that values the sacred dignity of all persons, even when those conversations are hard and uncomfortable. Moreover, these conversations, as they are characterized by respectful and mutual exchange of ideals, are animated not by a desire to pronounce the right answers, but by a yearning to seek the right questions. These are questions that help free us from making an idol of our own perspectives, our own traditions, and casting them as truth. Given the complexity of our very world, and the complicated realities of injustice before us, it is absurd for us to think that any one cultural faith or religious perspective or tradition could even begin to possess all the answers that would allow us to progress toward a more just way of being on this earth. Therefore, if we as a theological seminary are to even come close to being a seedbed for the justice that is God's, then we must be committed in all of our interactions to promoting the kind of dialogue that values the humanity of all engaged and incites thoughtfully hard questions about the assumptions we hold of ourselves, of one another, and of the truth that is God's loving justice, thereby opening us to new ways of seeing ourselves, the others, in the world. I believe that EDS is at Union, as it reflects the global richness that is the Anglican Communion and the world of faiths and cultures that is Union. I believe that this can indeed be that place of moral dialogue, and hence a place dedicated to probing the complexities, contradictions, and crises of our time in such a way that we are left not divided in chaos, but inspired to do the enduring work of evolving a just society. This brings me to a second aspect of the work we must do as a theological seminary. It is the work of nurturing a moral imagination. When I think of the significance of a moral imagination, I think of those who were born into slavery and who died in slavery and who never ever drew a free breath and in fact never had an expectation of drawing a free breath. And yet, they fought for freedom anyhow. They somehow had the resolve to fight tirelessly for freedom, even though they knew they would never see it. Such a resolve comes from a moral imagination. A moral imagination trusts that as God's love triumphed over the crucifying death of the cross, it will triumph over the crucifying realities of any time, such as the crucifying realities of slavery. A moral imagination envisions Isaiah's new heaven and new earth, where the wolf and the lamb shall lie down together, and believes that it will be made real. A moral imagination resists any notion that the world as it is the way it is going to be. Put simply, a moral imagination trusts that the arc of the universe, as King said, ultimately bends toward God's justice. And as 19th century philosopher William James says, even though all the tyrants and proprietors and monopolists of the world set their shoulders to heave the bar that is God's justice, they do so in vain. For James continues, it is impossible to tilt the beam that is the arc that bends toward justice. Believing in this is what the moral imagination is all about. And so it was a moral imagination that provided the resolve for the enslaved to fight for a freedom they knew they would never see, but a freedom they knew would be. Hence they sang, children, we shall all be free when the Lord shall appear. We want no cowards in our band, that will their colors fly. We call for valiant-hearted men that are not afraid to die. Children, we shall all be free, they sang. Now, what does this mean for us in this work we do here as a theological seminary? Last semester, a student asked me why we should continue to fight for a justice that we know just isn't going to happen. Was not such a fight in vain, the student queried. In answering this question, I thought of the enslaved who would steal away to the hush harbors from the watchful eye of their enslavers to pray to the God they knew as freedom. It was in those hush harbor times that their moral imagination was nurtured. I thought about Jesus, who went off to a lonely place to pray, and though Jesus was not crucified because he prayed, it was because he went off to a lonely place to pray that he was able to go to the cross. Inasmuch as we as a theological seminary are committed to planting the seeds for a just earth, then we must nurture within our students a moral imagination that will allow them to have the resolve to stay in the work of doing justice. And informed by no one less than Jesus, We do this by providing the opportunities for the kind of spiritual formation through prayer, worship, quiet days, contemplative and other practices that keep our students in touch with the very soul of who they are, and indeed keeps us as a theological seminary in touch with the soul of who we are. It is for this reason that EDS at Union unabashedly has a robust spiritual formation program. For spiritual formation is about nothing less than the care of the soul, the seat, if you will, of our moral imagination. And then there is this matter of moral proximity. If the work we are called to do as a seminary is about planting the seeds for God's just future, then we must also be committed to being a community that prioritizes moral proximity. Moral proximity is about being proximate, to borrow from the words of Brian Stevenson in his book, Just Mercy. Proximate with those persons who are on the very underside of justice. That is, with those persons who are victims of the harsh and crucifying realities of injustice. Inasmuch as God's justice means a restoration of the sacred dignity of all people, and it does, then it must begin with the crucified classes of people. Let us make no mistake about it. It is only when the least of these are free to live into the fullness of their created humanity that God's justice will be realized. Put simply, it is in the freedom of those who are crucified by crucifying realities of injustice that we can see the justice of God working in the world. In short, the justice of God always begins from the bottom up. As a theological seminary, moral proximity means making the voices of those on the underside of injustice a part of our intimate circle of interaction, listening to, learning from, and standing with them, so to do the work that is needed to bring about a society that they will recognize as just. This is why, as we sit here in this Morningside community, we are intentional in making sure that our students are not just making the turn to the right up toward Columbia and their libraries of learning, if we will, but that our students are making the turn to the left toward the laboratory of learning that is Harlem. Gustavo Gutierrez is right when he says, if we are to face these challenges of injustice in the right way, we must first see the real world without evasion. And my friends, this means seeking to understand the meaning of justice by being proximate with those who bear the cross of injustice. This is what moral proximity is all about. And finally, if the work of our soul is about partnering with God to mend the world of its injustice and thus building a world where everyone is cherished for who they are, then we must foster ministries committed to moral participation. Moral participation entails ministries that are at least characterized by what it means to be sanctuary and witness. To be a sanctuary means creating welcoming and safe spaces for those who are made to feel unwelcome and unsafe because of the various narratives, systems, and structures of injustice in our society and world. This is a space in which persons can thrive, feel connected, and discover their passions and their voice. It is for this reason that EDS at Union has joined with Union in being a sanctuary for those unjustly impacted by the current immigration policies. Moral participation as witness. It means raising our voices against that which stands in opposition to God's just future, as well as being exemplars of what that future looks like. Put simply, moral participation is not only about protests, but it is also about, as Mahatma Gandhi says, being the change we want to see. It is for this reason that as a theological seminary, we are committed to providing our students with the tools through a variety of programming and curricular opportunities to develop socially impactful ministries These are ministries that make a difference in the lives and communities as people struggle for justice. It is also why we as a seminary community remain engaged in the public square, speaking to the issues of our day. This is what moral participation is all about. And so what? What difference does this make, given the challenging times in which we find ourselves? How often is it that we lament the lack of moral courage from our elected and national leadership when it comes to pushing back against a vision to make America great again? This is a vision that fosters the criminalization of black people, the sexualization of women, the dehumanization of immigrants, and the nullification of transgender persons. This is a violent vision inasmuch as it violates the very sacred humanity of people. It violates our humanity. And as we have seen, the violence that is the Make America Great Again vision stokes violence. And so this is a vision that requires a moral response. There is much at stake in our nation. It is not about being a Republican or a Democrat, nor is it about conservative or progressive ideologies. At stake is the very soul of our nation. For it seems that our nation is without the moral leadership that would help it to live into the better angels of who we as a nation declare ourselves to be. It is therefore in such a time as this that theological seminaries have a special responsibility in providing the kind of moral leadership that can bring us closer to a just earth. Because of the soul of who we are, we can do no other. As I began with a story, let me end with a story, one that many of you again may be familiar with, so I beg your indulgence once again. When I was about 7 years old, I remember riding with my parents through the inner city of my hometown, Dayton, Ohio. It was a rainy evening. I looked out of the window of the car and noticed a little girl and boy crossing the street. They were about my age. I presumed them to be sister and brother. They were a bit disheveled and not properly dressed for the cold, rainy weather. From my 7-year-old perspective, they looked poor and hungry. Tears literally filled my eyes as I imagined for them a life of struggle. In the midst of my tears, I made a silent vow to one day come back and rescue those children from the blight of Dayton's inner city. Initially, I fantasized that I would grow up while they remained young and I would become a teacher and somehow change their life options. As I got older, the thought of those children never left me. They created within me a deep sense of accountability to the poor and marginalized people of our society. I was determined to find a vocation that would make a difference for the better in the lives of the least of these. I did not think that that would result in me being dean of a theological institution. But here I am. I accepted this call not because I wanted to be dean. Rather, it was because I believed that as EDS came together with Union, given their respective commitments to bringing faith and scholarship together in service of social justice, I believed that this affiliation would be about the work of providing the kind of moral leadership that would help change the world and thus to transform the lives of children like I encountered so many years ago. Yes, my friends, these are challenging times. But never before, as a theological seminary, had a more dramatic opportunity to be a sign of God's just earth than today. It is as we are EDS at Union that we can embrace this opportunity. This is our call. This is our challenge. This is the work our soul must do. Thank you.
I'll ask you to remain standing if you are able, since you're up, to honor our time together and to continue our celebration. We're going to move towards reception, but not without prayer of praise and thanksgiving for the new dean of this amazing seminary and for the good work it will do and for the ways in which we will continue together to help shape the church and the world into God's dream. So let us pray. Holy and gracious God, you are the master gardener. We give you thanks that you have seen it fit to bring into this space and to raise up the leadership of the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas to be Dean of EDS at Union. We know, O God, that you often do underneath the soil miracles that we cannot see. And so as seeds are sown and nurtured in the dark, we pray that with scholarship, leadership, care, and witness, that which you have sown would grow up to give shelter to the vulnerable, to stand strong in the winds of change and tumult, to be casters of shade and protection for those who need it, to stand strong, to be able to show the world that you are unshakable. May your blessing be upon Kelly and this school and all who study here, all who seek to find this to be a place of refuge because they want to grow and learn the ways of justice and the ways of Jesus. Prosper their work and ministry, that we may reap the harvest that only you can bear. It is in your holy and mighty name we pray. Amen. Party on, friends.